One of the most widely discussed developments of the last 10 years in the field of warfare has been this thing that we often call hybrid war. And it's essentially this set of tactics that Russia deployed when it seized Crimea from Ukraine, really very easily in 2014, and then to some extent the set of tactics it then deployed to take control of a big chunk of eastern Ukraine in the following weeks. And really the question is this like the next big thing in warfare? And if so, what are the implications? So what do we mean by hybrid war? Again, it describes this combination of tactics used by Russia in 2014. And the key elements were this: covert operations, that is, soldiers basically sneaking in and doing things before anybody really knew what was going on, so surprise. Irregular warfare, meaning not troops battling other troops, basically insurgent tactics. Cyber warfare, so doing all kinds of things to disrupt another side's ability to respond. And information warfare, basically using news media as well as social media to muddy the waters in terms of what people understood to be going on, and therefore really reducing or inhibiting any kind of political response against what Russia was doing. So let's talk a little bit more in detail what happened in Crimea. So the first thing that happened, and I won't go into all the stuff that led up to that, but the first thing that happened basically on February 28th of 2014 is the key points in Crimea suddenly were occupied by armed men in unmarked uniforms. And you can see this in the picture, which is there's a hand grenade, assault rifles, body armor, the whole 9 yards, but no insignia. No unit insignia, no national flags, no nothing. These are what became called little green men. Although sometimes the Russians also like to call them polite people, which was sort of tongue-in-cheek. So now all of a sudden, before really a shot's been fired, key transportation hubs, this is actually at the airport in Simferopol, which is the capital of Crimea, right? All of a sudden, overnight, when nobody even knew there was a war yet, these key places have been seized. Similarly, they seized the Crimean parliament and basically then had sympathetic Crimeans, ones who were sympathetic to Russians, sealed the building so that nobody else could come in. They took everybody's cell phones away so that nobody could know what was going on. And then they came out at the end and said, we're voting to secede. What really happened and who did what and what happened voluntarily, we don't know. The element of surprise was complete. The small number of Ukrainian forces in the region, in many cases, were taken by surprise and simply disarmed because they weren't ready to fight back. Russia said, these are not Russian forces. These are Crimeans who've decided to declare independence. And Russian news outlets spread that narrative all over the world so that in the days and weeks while this was, after this happened, there was this huge debate over who these guys really were. And by the time people had come to believe what I think was obvious in the first place, which is that these were Russians, right? It was too late. Russia took control of the peninsula, and it was like, okay, try to take it back. Good luck with that, right? So that was what happened in Crimea. And something similar happened in eastern Ukraine, except the Ukrainians were more successful in fighting back in eastern Ukraine, and that conflict is now stalemated for the past 7 years. Now, a really important question to ask is hybrid warfare really new, or is it merely an update on very traditional tactics of destabilization and intervention? If you think about the coup that the CIA supported against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, it's got some of the same elements. Here are some of the things that were perhaps unusual about Russia and Crimea. One is the use of troops in unmarked uniforms is unusual. It's a violation of the Geneva Conventions, and it means those soldiers lose the protection of the Geneva Conventions. So that's unusual. The use of social media to build support was new because in many respects social media is new. And also what seems a little bit novel is the way that Russia took a bunch of different tactics and seems to have packaged them up into a recipe that looks like it could be deployed in a lot of other situations as well. Whether that's true remains to be seen. So that is really one of the big questions, which is how easily can this model be replicated? And let me then point out some of the things that success in Crimea depended on, which might not be replicated in other places. First of all, because many people in that part of Ukraine tend to speak the Russian language, even if they're very much Ukrainian, just like lots of Americans speak English, even though we don't consider ourselves English, there was a difficulty distinguishing Russians from local Ukrainians. So it was easy for them to pretend that they were Ukrainians. There was also, the moment chosen was a moment of brilliance because there had just been a collapse of the Ukrainian government due to these protests in Kiev, and so the timing was ideally chosen when essentially for a few days there basically was no Ukrainian government. Moreover, Russia had its spies essentially. It had penetrated the Ukrainian military all the way back to the Soviet era because the Ukrainian military had been founded out of the Soviet Red Army. And so from the very beginning, there were people in the Ukrainian military who presumably were loyal to Moscow, not to Kiev. Similarly, there were enough people in Crimea who supported the idea of a Russian takeover that there could be some plausibility of this claim that, oh yeah, this is what the Crimean people want. And lastly, there was proximity, right? Russia is right next door to Crimea. It could ferry in troops by helicopter from Russia. It didn't even need to use more fancy transport. So all of those things made it particularly easy to do this in Crimea in 2014, and it's not clear, again, how replicable that is. From what I can tell, and this is what I study for a living, it seems pretty clear that the Russians had been making a plan to do something like this for a very long time and just sort of were waiting for the right opportunity. So it was a very well-planned and executed operation, taking advantage of a lot of particulars of that situation. But it gets to this bigger question of the extent to which you can use subversion as a substitute for war. In other words, if you don't want to try to conquer another country, which is expensive and dangerous and costly, as we've learned much to our hardship in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, can you instead simply change out the government, right, and replace a government that's against you with a government that supports you? That's essentially what the United States and Britain did with Iran in 1953. You could argue we did much the same thing in Chile in 1973, and this essentially is what the Russians were doing in Crimea. The Russians believe, or at least they say that they believe, I'm not sure they do. The Russians say, well, this is what the United States does when it's supporting, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine or this sort of thing. And in fact, both Russia and China think that this is what the United States is doing in supporting democracy movements in those countries, is basically trying to conquer them through internal chaos and division rather than by waging war. And I'm not sure those accusations are entirely accurate, but it is certainly the point that the United States thinks that either China or Russia would be a lot more friendly for us to deal with if it had a different kind of government. So the question then, again, is to what extent are some countries in the future going to be able to use these kind of tactics as a way of a different way of prosecuting geopolitical expansion? And that remains to be seen.